Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of Developing Classical Thinkers. My name is Winston Brady, and I'm the host of DCT. This podcast is a project of the faculty at Thales Academy. We're a network of private classical schools with campuses based mostly in Raleigh, North Carolina, but we also have campuses outside of Richmond, Virginia, Nashville, Tennessee, and Charlotte, North Carolina, with more coming on board each year. Given that this is a podcast run by the faculty at a classical school, a lot of times we'll get together and talk about some of our favorite teaching tips, favorite books, methods of teaching, and the like with members of our faculty. And today we're talking about seminar teaching. And I'm joined here by Kellie Scripter, Chris Scripter, and Chelsea Wagenaar. And we're all going to share our favorite tips for seminar teaching, some of our favorite books to seminar with students. So guys, thank you all so much for joining me on Developing Classical Thinkers today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
And we may want to talk about first what a seminar is not. So what does not constitute a seminar?
Well, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that a seminar, I hate to steal Winston's line here, but it's not the circus coming to town, this big exciting thing that everybody prepares for and goes to attend like it's theatrical. It's more of a habit. It can certainly be formal, but it's something that you want to be thinking about every time you have a discussion with your students. What are the seminar habits I can be instilling in them so that it's not just something temporary or just one moment?
Well, in terms of what it's not me doing all the talking. That's not typically something I'm ever guilty of, but I try to be very conscious when teaching with my attention toward seminar methods to have the students doing most of the talking. And I think of it, in terms of what it is, as how can I get the students to be the ones who do the learning for us today? I mean, really, that's how they learn, right? Learning is doing. So not me telling them what's important in a text or what I want them to think about, but kind of prompting them along the way so that they come to it themselves.
Right, because if they're the ones who are talking, they're excited about the book that we're reading or the experiment that we're breaking down or the idea that we're discussing.
I think a lot of people also put a lot of ritual around seminar, and I think that's kind of what you mean about the circus. Sort of thinking of seminar as something that has to have sort of elaborate setups. We often talk about how you must have a seminar circle and so on and so forth. And I tend to think that seminar is a disposition, right? A habit. It's not a set of procedures per se. That we shouldn't confuse the ritual of seminar with the quality of a seminar. Really, the quality is in the discussion that the students are able to have. The other thing I think about when I think about sort of what seminar is not is I try really hard to think about Socrates, from whom we get the idea of the Socratic seminar, right? This idea of a discourse and a dialogue as a form of education. And I think about Socrates, and I think he would be shocked to see some of the seminars that we call Socratic seminars, because he'd walk in and said, "That's not organic. That's not the way I did it at all." Or, it's like I didn't need to have everybody sit down in a circle and stare at me. I didn't need necessarily even to always have my text in front of me all the time, right? There were times when we lifted our heads out of the text and thought about what this meant to our person. And there's lots of ways in which I try to think, what might Socrates think if he was sitting in my seminar? Because I want to emulate him more.
Yeah, well, too, I think about that sometimes too, and I think he would say that we don't follow the same line of thought long enough. Yeah. Sometimes, this comes with the territory in teaching high schoolers or middle schoolers, that they can't pursue an idea extremely far, and that's part of what seminar teaching is coaching them toward, right? Is not just like you thought about it one time, you had one or two things to say, but what else does this lead us toward? What else can we say about that to be truly Socratic?
And there was the nickname that Socrates gave himself, being a gadfly of Athens, so somebody that's asking probing questions that are meant to excite interest. And he recognizes that the person has not thought as deeply as they should about the topic at hand and phrases his questions accordingly. Do you guys do that when you're reading through a great book, or you've got a wonderful lecture, Chris? Chris teaches modern European history, and so like your lectures are always well put together with lots of good questions that punctuate the material that you're giving. Do you guys do that though, thinking about like what's the question that will really start to spur interest in the students? especially if they feel like they know everything, right? I feel like that's really where that seminar teaching really starts to come out, because you're trying to lead the students to some sort of idea, some sort of line of thinking that perhaps they haven't considered before they came to the text.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have to do, first of all, I mean, when what you said, Winston, is that we have to do our thinking beforehand. I think one of the pitfalls of a seminar is to come in with a text and assume that the text can speak for itself without direction. But we have to remember these are students we're working with. These aren't intellectuals that come to a document with a great sort of toolbox with which they can analyze. And so part of the task is deciding what are those big questions that you want to drive them toward. And usually I tend to sit there and say, okay, so if this is the first time I've encountered this document, I talk to my colleagues, say, we want them to have a good first read. That means they don't need the nitpicky details all the time. What is, like, if this document is important, if this document is worth reading, what is the one thing I would love them to walk away with? And usually it is the thing that sort of reflects on their own humanity, right? The reason why great books are great is because they cause us to think about great things, and what's greater than who we are as people and how we relate to other people. So every time I throw a source in front of them, I want them to get at some point where they can hold a mirror in front of their faces, right? And so that's the one question I'm usually looking for and usually guiding them to.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't usually find that students feel they already know everything about a text. If anything, I find that they know nothing and have no thoughts about it at all. And so when I'm thinking about questions, I'm usually thinking, like, what is a question or two that's going to push the door open here and get them to see what there is to see? Like, what are we looking at, and what do I need to think about here, rather than just reading something and having, I don't know, kind of a blank stare or having no reaction to it at all. That's more what tends to happen.
Yeah, and sometimes I think we overlook how simple it can be as far as, you know, the questions that you're asking initially, especially, I mean, Chelsea, you can speak to this more probably with poetry, but I find in my own experience that when I was trained to seminar on poetry, you know, kind of partway through my career, like something was unlocked when I realized that I just need to focus on initial observations. What is going on in the poem? Like, what is the speaker experiencing? What is essentially almost the plot?
Where are we?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And for students to kind of show that to students that it's as simple, like there's no secret meaning to unlock, you know, immediately. There's nothing that's sort of purposefully mysterious,
Preach.
you know, that the author's keeping from us. Yeah. And so, I mean, I have an anecdote of this. A class that I was teaching, we were reading Mary Oliver's Mushrooms, and I was being observed by my head of school at the time. And I was a young teacher, and I wanted to impress, and my students wanted to impress. And so we were trying to find all of these, you know, hidden metaphors and all these references and allusions. And he was so gracious, but he said, may I intervene? And he said, can we just get back to what Mary Oliver says about mushrooms, right? Like, what are her simple observations about what mushrooms look like? What, you know, what like, get back to the senses. And we all just went, oh, like, what a relief, you know? Now, we certainly can go further than that, and we can dig deeper, but sometimes it starts with a simple observation. There doesn't need to be a lot of pressure to, you know, to have it be meaningful right away.
Which is a part of scaffolding, right? You need to have the intuition to know what sort of scaffolding might be required to engage the text meaningfully, and, you know, to come in with the sort of big abstract question right at the beginning you're going to get a lot of crickets chirping in the classroom, but to break it down and scaffold it is a lot more important, and bring it back to the rudiments. I think when in books, to piggyback off the comment about, you know, experiencing, let's just talk about mushrooms, right? In books, and you think about characters, well, let's just talk about what the characters do. Yes. Let's let the characters lead us through this discussion until we get to sort of the big analytical questions. Yeah. That scaffolding is really important, and sometimes overlooked, because we really want those rich, deep, analytical, thought-provoking questions that I talked about earlier, but if you can't access them right away.
Well, right, and the scaffolding is important because that's how we figure out what the students actually know and got. They can't usually get to the bigger abstract questions about a text because they might have missed, you know, what the character's conflict was or something really important that happened. And when we talk like that, like when it comes to poetry, when I teach poetry, I always start with what is the literal situation? Yes. Who is speaking? Where are we? What is happening in the poem before I even allow them to talk about anything else? But that helps the students sort of become confident in talking about a text, right? Because they see, okay, like, this isn't intimidating. I can talk about this. I got one or two things from reading this poem, and then that, helps bring voices into the conversation.
And Socrates broke down really complicated issues like that, not throwing out the very broad, general, universal question that solicits like nothing from students in class, the kind of which we just sit there and wait for somebody to be brave enough to answer the question. He tended to break it down. There were a lot of yes or no questions that he would ask his interlocutors. He would use relatively simple metaphors, like he's talking about the profound issue of justice and injustice. He's talking about horses and coaches and gymnastics and things that are concrete and relatively easy to access. Krista, when I start with thinking about my lesson for that day, or whether it's a historical event, so I'm maybe doing a lecture or a meaningful text that I want to read with students, whatever it happens to be, I'm like you, starting with that great idea that I would really like the students to interact with, to approach, Lord willing, to understand. That tends to be kind of my first sort of big principle when it comes to seminar teaching, is starting with that amazing idea that if students discover it for themselves, not that I tell them, but that they figure it out by reading the text and, Lord willing, by me questioning them and so on, that they come to discover it for themselves, and in that way it would just transform their lives for the better. So all of us here, we've got a particular text that we really like to seminar through. I don't think I've actually ever led a seminar on the text that I selected. It's a dialogue by Plato called the Gorgias. And I chose it because this was one of the first philosophy texts, dialogues that I read where I actually got what Plato was saying. And it just it unlocked a whole rich avenue of intellectual and emotional and just character building, events in my life, and it was just wonderful. So we'll probably, if that's good, we can maybe transition into sharing our best seminar tip and the text that we brought along to support that, especially since that kind of plays along with the idea of breaking it down and scaffolding it. So I've got this passage here. I remember reading through it over and over again at a coffee shop in Siracusa, Sicily. I was very blessed with a classical education growing up from middle school through college. And I got to study abroad in a very beautiful city in Sicily where Plato had visited and had written some of his dialogues. So I felt this really profound connection with the author. But Plato, by way of Socrates, says, so pastry baking, as I say, is the flattery that wears the mask of medicine. And he's talking here about how orators can master a series of rhetorical arts, and they can dress up what are essentially lies and spacious arguments and make them sound like the truth, make them sound very convincing. But in reality, these unscrupulous orators are just trying to get rich or get voted into office and amass power. So pastry baking, as I say, is the flattery that wears the mask of medicine. Cosmetics is the one that wears that of gymnastics in the same way. A mischievous, deceptive, disgraceful, and ill-bred thing, one that perpetuates deception by means of shaping and coloring, smoothing out and dressing up, so as to make people assume an alien beauty and neglect their own, which comes through gymnastics. So that I won't make a long style speech, I'm willing to put it to you the way the geometers do. For perhaps you follow me now, that what cosmetics is to gymnastics, pastry baking is to medicine, or rather like this, what cosmetics is to gymnastics, sophistry, the art of making really bad arguments appear true, is to legislation. And what pastry baking is to medicine, oratory is to justice. And I remember sitting there in the coffee shop, just pounding espresso and trying to struggle through this particular passage and stuff. It hit me that there are some things in this world that appear very good, but they're in fact really bad. And, at their heart of it, at their essence, they're not essentially good. They're destructive and so on. So a cookie tastes really good, but in reality, it's just a lot of empty calories and sugar. In high school, I struggled with drinking and depression a lot. And so the way that I gravitated towards alcohol, it promised the same sorts of things, promising happiness and joy, but really robbing me of those things at their essence. The ideas and the good life that Socrates was laying out, throughout this particular dialogue and others, and other books that I was reading in other classes at the time, that was the real happiness and the real joy that at their essence are in fact good. I remember just sitting there and just blown away. It was amazing. If we can create that sort of experience for students, I feel like we've done a good job, or at least tried to do that, because we can't lead students to such a profound realization, but man, it's wonderful when you see those light bulbs go off.
Right, well, even to create it is one thing, but to give them the tools to have that kind of experience. Like, in order for you to read that and think that way, it's because you had the tools that maybe had been gained in the classroom.
In many dark nights of the soul.
Moment. Yeah.
I think that's important to recognize that we started this speaking about what seminar is not. It is not always apparently productive, or you don't walk away knowing that you've been successful. You don't know, and we may never know from the students, but it's about giving them those tools, and that's okay. We have to be comfortable with that. If we're asking them to wrestle with these big things, they're not in 45 minutes or 90 minutes going to walk out that door transformed yet, right? Necessarily. That's certainly the dream, but we have to be comfortable.
That's one of the hard things about teaching, I think, is that sometimes really what you're sowing, you don't get to see.
Yeah.
It takes a long time.
We get to be faithful in what we do in the classroom each day. Part of the tools is just the really good books, that we get to put in front of students, ones that help us to understand what it means to be human, and going through and just modeling those sorts of habits as to what you need to do in order to really get the most out of this particular text. Do you get anybody here have a habit that kind of corresponds to that?
Yeah, I think, I'm teaching 6th grade literature this year, and one of the things I'm encouraging my students to do is to focus on the characters, to stay in the world of the text. It's very tempting to try to apply, abstract themes and be thinking about things sort of outside of the world of the text. And I try to encourage them that it's freeing to just focus on these characters. Your job right now is a student of this book. You just get to know people, and it will tell them about something about human nature, but I don't even necessarily have to be explicit about that, saying this is telling us what it is like to be human in this moment. No, they can, that's again, one of those things, maybe down the road ththey gonna realize that, but they need to have their own personal experience with that. Chris and I have read this book by Luigi Giussani called The Risk of Education, and one of the things, it's geared towards a Christian audience for Christian education, but one of the things that he mentions in this book is the verification, the moment of verification that the student needs to do that themselves. Like, we cannot possibly insist upon students that they will, walk away with some nugget of truth from the text, but they have to go through it themselves. And so, when I'm encouraging them to stay in the world of the story, like, I just have to trust that they will have that moment themselves, and that I can't force it on them. They have to go through that verification themselves. But at least I can guide them. Keeping them in the world of the story is it's part of that scaffolding, I guess. But I find it's really freeing for them. They're like, oh, it really is that simple, right?
Yeah. I think there's room to ask about that too. I always like toward the end of a text, when we have most of it behind us and we have kind of the big picture of the text, to ask a question like, as you were reading this, what is something you feel like you learned from this book? Yeah. Or, something personal that you connected to, and usually it's character driven, right? Like, there's a moment of maybe self-reflection or introspection that happens in response to a character. I haven't had a lot of luck getting students to talk about that, but I have had students write some pretty profound things in response to a question like that. That shows me light bulbs were going off, but we don't want to, they don't want to look too vulnerable in front of their peers.
Right, and they don't want to talk about themselves, right? So,
and how much more freeing it is to stick to the text.
Yeah, I always think of Huck Finn. When I first read Huck Finn, I don't think I thought much of it. When the first year I taught it, I found it very challenging, and now I've taught it several times, and I love it every time I read it. I love it more and more. And I found, students are not going to experience what Huck experiences. They're not going to be traveling down the Mississippi River with, a runaway slave and encounter all of these unique individuals. But it's the closest they'll get to that. And so in getting to know Huck, they can kind of live vicariously through him, what it might be like to resort to, he resorts to lying all the time, right? And his conscience is developing, and it's such a beautiful coming of age story. They're not going to be able to experience that. They're never going to go through that themselves, but they can kind of live it through Huck, and it can be transformative. But there's really, there's no other way. Same with Crime and Punishment. You teach, right? They're not going to go through what Raskolnikov goes through, right? But wow, what a neat adventure for them to consider, right? What would it be like, And they don't want to talk about it from their perspective, like, oh, I went through this myself, or this is what happens when I've lied or when I've done something, I've committed a sin or something. They're not comfortable, they're not ready for that, but they can do it through the lens of a character.
Right, and that's a good example of what you were talking about, like something that to Raskolnikov looked good. Mm-hmm. He morally justified the murder of this woman, but at its heart, it was not good, as the next 6 parts of the novel unfold in great detail. It was punishing, so they, can experience it through Raskolnikov instead of for themselves on such a scale, hopefully.
Which is why, of course, we always talk about in classical education, we talk a lot about the moral imagination and how specifically, especially a literature curriculum, but other aspects of the curriculum allow sort of to dwell and inhabit that moral imagination, to ponder and consider the moral repercussions of choices and actions. And I think, you were saying that you don't want to necessarily sort of force that on them, right? You want to invite them to it and trust in this process. I think one way that we do that also is modeling it. I have become increasingly more comfortable in my career now, sort of modeling for them that wrestling with a particular moral conundrum in the text, or even to come out. I remember just the other day in class, I boldly proclaimed, this guy is my favorite character. I think he's so noble. I absolutely adore knowing him as a person. And I asked my students why, because I just wanted to see that I was wrestling with the reality of that character. His nobility was inspiring to me. It was Hector.
Oh, Hector, that was going to be my second guess.
But for them to see that, their teacher is thinking about this person on a personal level, right? Not just thinking about who the character is and what the character does, but I'm wrestling with this on a personal level. And I think literature allows that. Philosophy, of course, allows us to think more in the abstract when we've encountered those moments. History, of course, allows us to think about humans in the past that have, and the world there. But all 3 of those situations, we can model, right? That sort of moral engagement with the text.
And sense of wonder. I had the pleasure of being in Chelsea's class just the other day. What was the poem again? I know you were looking at an Edward Hopper image as well, one of his paintings.
It was just called Edward Hopper's New York movie.
New York movie,
yeah.
And you were just delighting in it. And you openly said something along the lines of, I'm grappling with this line, I'm wrestling with this. And I think that invitation to vulnerability, it doesn't mean you're suggesting you haven't considered it a lot. It's just that, we're human and we're still struggling with figuring out what some of these things mean ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, and when I say, that was one thing I had noted as a practice that I try to make a habit when I'm teaching, to be transparent about the parts of a story that I find really difficult, or that I just kind of struggle with, or a character, or what is my thought process as I'm reading this. And it's always genuine. Like, I never make that up for the sake of engineering some discussion, but I have learned from students. Yes. Like, when I, say, what do you think about this? I don't know what to think about this, or I hate this part, I can't make it make sense, or they'll always, 1 or 2 are like, oh, I have some thoughts, and then they feel even more emboldened to share, I think, because they're like, oh, I have really something to offer. I'm not just saying something that you've already thought of, but it's something that might actually help. And students have really changed the way I've read some texts, for sure.
Yeah, I like to use we language a lot, especially with 6th graders. Like, we are on this journey. We were on the Argo just a few weeks ago with the Argonauts, and I don't know if that helps, but it seems like there really is a collective we. It's not me sort of imparting something on them.
I try to find through question and answers like that meaningful touch point. I mean, Huckleberry Finn is fantastic because Huck Finn really doesn't want to be at school. And for the most part, a lot of times kids at any given point of the day, they don't want to be at school either. There is a meaningful point of contact. Raskolnikov, we've all kind of grappled with whether or not we cross over some sort of moral boundary into the abyss. And, we really need to read what happens to him when he goes over that boundary so that we can hold students back from the edge. And so on and so forth. History, I love reading meaningful seminar texts in history class because you do get the human element of it. Like, there is a character, like very much a character back in the historical past that we can learn from. But a lot of times there can be something sort of revelatory about the text in question that maybe explains something that's going on right now that we have to deal with.
If I could, maybe I could piggyback off that. I tend to think that history is sort of the unsung subject in which seminar can be really useful.
Yeah.
We tend to think of history. Sometimes we tend to think of history as lecture-based textbooks. We think of these sort of formulaic things, and you have to memorize the who, what, where, when, and why of the past. But certainly in a classical setting, you need to be in the sources, you need to be in the text, because history is about the human story, and humans produce texts that we get to wrestle with. And so I actually enjoy opportunities to seminar, and when I say seminar, I mean in the full extent of the word, in the same way I would in a literature class, through texts. And I like to find ones that both speak to the present reality of the present reality that we live within, as you were just suggesting, but also the historical circumstance that we're in. Like, those are sometimes pretty hard to find, but they exist, they're there. There's lots of great, rich texts that as you read them, you realize, oh wow, this man in 1820 was wrestling with something in the human condition, which is still true in 2025, right? When you can find those are the texts that really elevate a history curriculum. And so I actually brought one with me that I happen to really enjoy, and maybe I'll share a couple things. And I think anybody could see why this maybe sort of could parallel or allow for an open or a more open discussion about what it means to be human in an age of progress, in an age after the scientific revolution, in an age after the Enlightenment. So this is by Prince Metternich, who is an Austrian diplomat. This is his text, an excerpt from his text, Confession of Faith in 1820. I'll just read a couple quotes by jumping around, just so we can get a sense of what he's saying. But I think he is kind of commenting. He's commenting specifically on the post-Napoleon world and sort of the radical revolutionary changes that the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era brought. But I think more importantly, he is given a confession of faith, what he believes to be true about the human person. And
it's almost like a soliloquy, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, he's bearing his soul in the form of this document.
In the same way that Augustine might have. And so he writes, "The progress of the human mind has been extremely rapid in the course of the last 3 centuries. This progress, having been accelerated more rapidly than the growth of wisdom, the only counterpoise to passion and to error, a revolution prepared by the false systems, the fatal errors into which many of the most illustrious sovereigns of the last half of the century fell, has at last broken out in a country advanced in knowledge and enervated by pleasure." He continues, "Having now thrown a rapid glance over the first causes of the present state of society," which he identified as moving too quickly to keep up with wisdom couldn't keep up. "It is necessary to point out in a more particular manner the evil which threatens to deprive it at one blow of the real blessings, the fruits of genuine civilization, and to disturb in the midst of its enjoyments. This evil may be described in one word: presumption, the natural effect of the rapid progression of the human mind toward the perfecting of so many things." Pause. Make sure the students understand what presumptuous mean. What does it mean to be a presumptuous man? Continuing down later, "Knowledge seems to come by inspiration. Experience has no value for the presumptuous man. Faith is nothing to him. He substitutes for it a pretended individual conviction, and to arrive at this conviction dispenses with all inquiry and with all study. For these means appear too trivial to a mind which believes itself strong enough to embrace at one glance all questions and facts. Power resides in himself. Why should he submit himself to that which was only useful for the man deprived of light and knowledge?" Right, and if you keep going with this, it's a beautiful text, and one that I think every student should wrestle with at some point in their history curriculum. But in here he's describing the problems of the modern man in 1820. Yeah. And I very much think that as I read that, the idea of our progress outpacing our wisdom, the presumptuous man, dispensing with knowledge, dispensing with inquiry and genuine study, I would hope those would resonate with the students. And so I love those sorts of texts where you can say, so what does this mean? Can you see the parallels in today with this document? So that's a rich sort of text and a rich opportunity, I think, for a history teacher.
And I think too, because it's very easy to dunk on Clemens von Metternich as the architect of a system that protected the aristocracy, conservative institutions in Europe, and like most traditional history courses would kind of portray him as like an enemy of such progress.
Absolutely.
Whereas the text that you read out is very much like defending what real progress looks like, as far as being wise enough to know things that you should do and things that you definitely shouldn't do.
And that challenges them, right? Because they too are inclined to hear the words like, here's a guy who defends aristocracy, but maybe he's doing it for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's something to his understanding of human progress, right? And those sorts of conversations are really rich.
We just read, my seniors, I teach 12th grade US history, and we just read Albert Hubbard's Message to Garcia. Chris, you're familiar with this work. Albert Hubbard wrote an essay about Andrew, I believe his name is Andrew Rowan, this man who, in the midst of the Spanish-American War, was able to go into Cuba and deliver a message to a general for President McKinley, although, of course, we can't actually verify that he did this, that this actually happened. But Hubbard used, even though it was quasi-fictional, Hubbard uses this story to sort of criticize the industrial world, industrial society, where men can't do things any longer. They can't just get, he keeps saying, they can't get a message to Garcia. They ask too many questions. They need to consult too many people. They can't just sit down and get something done. And it speaks to, no longer, you don't have this generation of these, Civil War soldiers who, displayed honor on the battlefield. They gave it everything. Now you have these men sitting behind desks, or doing just menial tasks. And so it's certainly a commentary on, it's something you could ask about the 2000s, right? Are we too reliant on some of these processes and technology, and that we can't just do things for ourselves independently? And so reading that with students first, kind of, what is he arguing? And then asking them, well, why do you think I introduced this source? What does this say about what we've just studied in industrial America? And we don't have to necessarily ask what it might mean for the 21st century, but they should be thinking about it. It's extremely, pertinent to the experience, I think, of high school seniors who are kind of, grappling with what's next for them. And, they're looking at their industriousness, maybe, hopefully they're reflecting, they're thinking about college, and, am I the kind of person who can do a task and complete it? Yeah, to show initiative, absolutely. So I love that perspective that, we can use historical sources to teach virtue, to point out what is possible or maybe what's lacking, even though it was, a source came from a completely different century.
And to show wisdom, and that needs to be done with discipline. There's ways in which the history conversation could quickly become not about the history any longer, and there are dangers and pitfalls to that. But at the end of the day, there are great opportunities to have those reflective, sort of stare in the mirror moments for the students.
I think that also reflects just as much like your passion for history and for teaching history and for communicating these profound lessons to students. Sometimes the narrative of the grand story of history and so on. I think about like what's the real pinnacle of American history, because we talk about maybe like the high point of a great civilization. I think it'd be easy to say like us landing on the moon, because that's seemingly like a great technological feat. And distance-wise, I don't think we've ever beaten something like that. But when you deal with like real historical accounts of real ordinary people triumphing over the odds, I think your text, like for me, the highlight is D-Day and Iwo Jima. Just ordinary farm boys, mechanics from the streets of New York, knives in their teeth, climbing up cliffs. Yeah. And you kind of lose the grandeur of such moments. You really need words to bring out just the heroism exhibited by very ordinary people, as the text that you brought out just did. Most of the time, the Spanish-American War is kind of seen as like a weird sort of mix of yellow journalism and jingoism and, Roosevelt's Rough Riders.
Right, I was just going to say, that's what we tend to focus on,
But not the heroism of like one person who's just doing what he was asked to do.
Same with the Civil War, one of my favorite sources. So I think that's, if we're speaking about seminar practices, we do need to think about, especially for teaching history, there are so many sources we could put in front of students, but we do need to be very intentional about what we want them to read. We've talked about this, Winston, for the Civil War. Okay, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, right? You absolutely have to make that's a must. But what other sources can you look at? Maybe the Emancipation Proclamation. One thing I like to have students do is look at letters written by ordinary soldiers. The Sullivan Blue Letter, I believe you're familiar with that. A Union soldier, he actually ended up dying at the Battle of Bull Run, but he wrote a letter to his wife.
Which one?
First, I think the first, yeah. So very, very early, he wrote a letter to his wife, Sarah, and it's you can look this up. It's in Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War. He does this beautiful reading of it with music in the background and with some photographs and some paintings. You can probably find it on YouTube, but Sullivan Ballou writes to his wife, Sarah, and it's just the most beautiful piece of writing, his sentiments. And of course, he expresses his love for his wife, but he also describes his commitment to the cause. And we tend not to think about that with Union soldiers. We tend to think that Southerners, the Confederates were the ones holding fast to a cause. They were defending something. But Union soldiers, all the same, were committed to the Union, to the nation. And it's such a beautiful, he's an ordinary soldier. It's not you may not see it in every source book, in every reader that you pick up, but it's an opportunity for students to look at an ordinary man and to talk about what it was like and how you can't help but think of how honorable he was, regardless of, your perspective on what side. The fact that he would, his generosity and his loyalty and his commitment to his wife to write this letter. It's astonishing. To me, it's more impressive than, not necessarily than Lincoln's address, but it's really meaningful and moving. And what a great opportunity for students to see that an ordinary person can write that.
Yeah. It seems like, that example nuances the way they would think of the Civil War, right? Yes. To hear another voice from sort of like someone on the ground, right? Rather than necessarily just examining the Emancipation Proclamation or more famous texts associated with that period. I don't know the text you're referencing, Chris. I haven't read it, but it's interesting to me to hear you say that he would be probably painted sort of two-dimensionally as defending the aristocracy, like you said, and yet you can hear the wisdom in what he has to say. And without examining that text, the students would maybe have a more shallow picture of him or of this period of time. And I'm thinking about that and I think for me, at least subconsciously, it's nice to articulate it, one of the goals of seminar teaching for me as students go out is that they are trained to think in such nuanced ways and their attention is trained, right? Like when you spend time in a text and unpack it and you seminar on it, the students have to look at it for a long time, right? They have to look at it, they have to inquire, they have to talk about it, think about it longer than they want to necessarily. But I think it sort of like builds that perseverance in their attention and teaches them that this is the way that you need to be going through your life, is like looking carefully like that. And I think seminar teaching cultivates that in the way they think, or I hope it does.
If we were to summarize too, like each of our best tips, for me, finding the very best idea that you hope students would discover for themselves, sticking to the text. Chris, would you say like modeling the sort of passion, being the sort of historian that you would want students to be?
Yeah, you put the words right in my mouth. I think you have to model the type of engagement you want with that text, and you have to be excited about it. There's almost a pastoral quality to what you're doing in the middle of a seminar. And the analogy of a conductor is really important. Oftentimes, it's sort of these circles of people that conduct seminar, they think, oh, you're like a conductor, right? You know when to, have this section crescendo and that section decrescendo and move the movement along and speed up and so on and so forth. And all that energy is really from the conductor. And so I think you have to know what you're doing, you have to know where you want the crescendos and the decrescendos, and you have to model that for them, to use the analogy. Yeah.
And then finding the details and calling their attention to it.
Yes, and I would say perhaps more broadly, teaching them how to inquire. Like questions are very important to me. I spend a lot of time thinking about what questions are going to open up a story or a passage or a chapter. And so for students to learn how to ask the right questions, that's a goal of mine.
And I see you've got The Great Gatsby there. Would you like to read a passage and maybe see if we can find some of the choice details that you would hope us to find?
Sure. I was thinking about the very end. The Great Gatsby has that extremely famous sort of glittering last sentence. We beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. But before that, I think it's easy to miss. When Nick has wandered down to Gatsby's shore and he's sitting here by the Sound, and the moon rises higher and the houses begin to melt away, It says, gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And I like to spend a lot of time on this paragraph because it's easy to blow right past what he's really saying here at the end, because he's zoomed out, so to speak, and this is not just a story of Gatsby and Daisy and like a love triangle, right? And I'll start by saying, who are the Dutch sailors? Why is he talking about Dutch sailors in this paragraph? And usually, a couple students are like, they founded New York, the Dutch founded New York. And then they realize that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the founding of this place and the dream that was in the mind of the sailors that came to found this place. And that was the last time there was a dream commensurate to our capacity for wonder. That was the end of the dream, right? Yeah. Gatsby's green light coming to nothing and his love for Daisy coming to nothing, that wasn't it at all. Like, the dream was over already before Gatsby even had a dream of Daisy. And so I like for them to see how he frames, it's pretty bleak, honestly. The whole story is glittering as it seems on the outset. What's being articulated here is really that the dream is lost before it ever began. So I like to just kind of pause and go through these sentences, like, what is he talking about? What is he saying about human dreams in this moment? And just close read sentence by sentence and ask the students, what insight is Nick coming to about our capacity for wonder? What insight is he coming to about our dreams? What does he realize in this moment? Is this hopeful? Is this bleak? How do you read these paragraphs? And usually you can see some light bulbs going off, because this is the sort of thing, there's like a description. They're not reading too deeply into that, but I think really one of the revelations of the text is right here at the very end in the last page. And to miss this is to miss, I think, what Fitzgerald wanted to say was what he comes to here at the end, that it was already over from the very beginning. As soon as they arrived on shore, the dream of America was like sort of popped like a bubble.
There's a potential, there's a dream, and it's all gone before any of us ever started. The line, like, understood nor desired, always gets me. It's like maybe like coming out, seeing this untapped continent and just seeing all sorts of opportunities for personal enrichment. Right. All this timber, like, we can cut it down and send it back to England and, make ships. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Like, there's something missed, I suppose, when you focus only on the here and the now and what it can benefit you. Yeah. I don't know, what sorts of answers do students give?
They start to get that he's talking about the founding of America here, and that's what he's comparing it to. Sometimes they'll notice because earlier in the novel, when it goes back in time and talks about when Gatsby and Daisy first met, and how, like, the first time he kissed Daisy, she blossomed for him like a flower. And we kind of talk about what's implied there, like, as soon after a flower blossoms, what happens next? And so there's like this death that's kind of implied in their coming together. It's a death rather than a birth. And when he says here, the old island that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, sometimes students will say, oh, it's like Daisy. Like, the same metaphor is used for when he kisses Daisy for the first time, she blossomed, right? So they can do some really good close reading, if we've done our due diligence along the way. But they usually see, like, this is pretty bleak. It's beautifully written, it's lyrical, but the picture here is of futility, right? We beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. We make no progress. It's the same story told over and over again.
It was like the reference to the Dutch sailors, because it's like the birth of an America no one knew existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, that's very much an unsung part of the American story.
Mm-hmm. They should take a good history class.
Mm-hmm. They should come to Thales.
But they always know, because they had a good history class.
I did. I asked them, we just got to the 1920s. I said, tell me what the American dream is. And they were like, Gatsby. And we're like, well, I know you nuanced it a little bit.
Yes.
So. But it's true. I mean, how neat though that from reading literature and from your, from seminaring on it, that they were able to take away, it's more about opportunity and the chase, than the actual achievement of it. And they didn't need a history lesson on that. They got it from good literature and your guidance.
And I really appreciate, Chelsea, what you're thinking about, like perseverance, dwelling in a text, building up that sort of like gumption to stick with and look closely. And I wonder if that's just part of the art of being a good seminar teacher, is recognizing those passages that are really thick, that on the surface seem thin, right? It's like when you're reading along in a text, you realize that paragraph is worth dwelling on. And there's a certain intuition that goes with that, but there's a real art in that, and there's a real sense of discipline that this is worth dwelling on. To see that and to kind of give them the space to do that is one of the great gifts we can offer.
Yes. Yeah.
The author struggled with profound issues, profound ideas, and pouring it into those paragraphs that you just read and giving the students, time to digest it, think about it for themselves. I think if you were to summarize the moral, like, you just ruined the experience.
Oh, for sure.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We've covered an awful lot of ground today concerning the best habits and practices of a seminar teacher. So not that we can really boil it down to like 4 principles, because I feel like that would probably ruin the experience as much as anything else. But for a teacher who's hoping to inspire in their students a love of learning and a willingness to work hard and labor over a meaningful work of literature or a science experiment or a painting, really any sort of instance, artifact of human culture. So looking at the ideas that, if students were to discover them for themselves, would profoundly impact their lives for the better, sticking to the text, modeling the sort of love and enthusiasm and gumption, grit, dare I say, or pluck that students should have in order to really digest a meaningful work of literature and come to a deeper understanding. And I mean, would you say pointing out those details, or even just letting the details speak for themselves and, trusting, asking the right questions and just hoping that the students pick up on the things that they really should, that are good, true, and beautiful? Is there anything about seminar teaching that we haven't covered here today that we should end with?
I just might end with, I recently read an article, Who is Socrates Now That We Need Him More Than Ever, by Richard Mitchell, in his book, The Gift of Fire. And in it he says, so many people try to emulate Jesus, speaking to a Christian audience. And nobody thinks that's an absurd statement to say, I want to be like Christ. But if somebody says, I want to be like Socrates, they kind of look at you and think it's impossible. Yeah. It's not impossible to be like Socrates. It really isn't. To model that for them, to model it in your own life, and to offer it to our students, and to let them be like Socrates too, right? If we can give them those opportunities and say, this is a man we want to emulate.
His humility included.
His humility included, his willingness to learn from you. Yeah. It's a great article. I commend it to people's attention.
Intellectual curiosity. I mean, at the heart of it, that is the person of Socrates. Just a willingness to engage with ideas that matter.
Yeah. And the humility, right? The opposite of that presumption that you were talking about.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys all so much for being on this episode of Developing Classical Thinkers. I've really enjoyed the time and your insights into the nature of seminar teaching. And thank you all so much for listening to this at home. If you're interested in the unique brand of classical education that we have here at Thales Academy, please check us out at our website at www.thalesacademy.org. And for Developing Classical Thinkers, I'm Winston Brady. Until next time, stay classy and stay classical.